The sweetest part was the first alert. In the end, I'll tell you the phrase I wish I had said. Dear daughter, it's night, and the house is so quiet that even the sound of the pen seems loud. I'm writing this so you won't repeat it. Back then, I felt exhausted. And it wasn't just tiredness. It was as if every breath was a weight. When someone looked at me as if I were precious, I wanted to believe it meant I was safe. We were in the car, after dinner. The streetlight slid by the dashboard. He smiled and said something that made my heart soften. Then, almost gently, he added a condition, a very small one. He wanted me to always say where I was, as if that were an act of love. It sounded like, I just care. I worry about you. But what did that mean in my life? I need access to you to feel in control. And then, if affection comes with a rule, pause. If concern turns into pressure, pause. And I didn't realize, if a compliment carries a trap, be cautious. The first time he said that, I felt special. But soon that feeling turned into emptiness, into a suffocating expectation. And then, joy dissolved into a silent confusion, because I wanted to please. But at the same time, I sensed that something wasn't right. That's when one night I decided to go out with my friends. A simple dinner, a moment that should have been light. Laughter echoed through the restaurant walls, and I let myself be swept away by the feeling of freedom. But he was there, in the back of my mind, like an insistent shadow. The unanswered message blinked on my phone. Questions that should have been harmless began to haunt me. Where are you? Is everything okay? And then, I found myself feeling guilty. Joy turned into panic. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just about where I was. It was about the control he needed, which meant that, in that vibrant place, I was no longer myself. I was just playing a role. Your expectations were an invisible chain pulling me down, sinking in the water while everyone around me swam. Then, after a few days, something happened. He got closer, and even with that charming smile, there was tension in his words. You know I only care, right? And I didn't realize, at that moment, I had already learned not to question. I accepted the statement as if it were a mantra, even knowing my body trembled under the weight of those expectations. But soon came the unspoken rule. When he said he didn't want me to leave again without telling him, it felt like protection, but in reality, it was a barrier. Not an umbrella shielding me from the storm, but a cage limiting my movements. Love disguised as care, and I was so immersed in the fog that I couldn't see the truth hovering in front of me. Weeks passed, and I felt more and more trapped. The guilt grew, the pressure mounted, a true internal battle. The messages became more frequent, more demanding. The more I tried to forget, the more I felt his hand tightening around my wrist. What didn't I understand? How did an act of affection turn into a silent shackle? On a particularly difficult day, I sat alone on the couch. The lights were off, and the silence was almost tangible. Memories of our story danced in my mind, and I wondered when it all began. It was when the first display of affection became an invisible chain, and I didn't realize that the line between love and control was thin, almost invisible. Finally, one drop spilled over. He called me, and his voice on the phone sounded different, firmer. You weren't responding, I was worried. A knot formed in my throat. I'm sorry, I said, but the sorry was filled with resignation, not regret. I tried to explain that I just needed some time. However, what once felt like concern now sounded more like an accusation, and I never knew if it was just me or if his love had truly changed. Could I trust someone who wouldn't respect my space? I felt like I was in a strange dance, where I was always taking 2 steps back. My feelings were stifled under the weight of his incessant watchfulness. And then, like a snap, I realized the absurdity of it all. I began to think about the little things that didn't feel right. My friends would ask me why I seemed so distant, and I would just smile, trying to hide the confusion. And that confusion was turning into something bigger, something that trapped and isolated me, and I couldn't bear it any longer. On those quiet nights, writing in my journal, I would vent. Every word felt like a silent scream, a cry for help. I sought clarity in the chaos, trying to lay bare the raw truth, and deep down, I knew that the persistence of his rules wasn't love. It wasn't safety. It was possessiveness disguised as affection. That love that promised to protect only served to build walls around me, and I I longed for freedom, for the certainty that love shouldn't come with rules, and in the silence of the house, I understood that this cycle needed to be broken. The answer wasn't in the disguised affection, but in the courage to claim my voice. And upon recognizing this pattern, I realized it wouldn't be easy to escape this web. But true strength lies in accepting that the responsibility is mine. It wasn't his fault, but the choice to protect myself, that was exclusively mine. I had finally understood that love shouldn't be a negotiation. Yet, even so, the shadows continued to follow me. The inner voices whispered that maybe I was exaggerating, that perhaps it was just insecurity. All those questions and doubts that fueled this vicious cycle wouldn't cease, and it was on one of those lonely nights that I decided to seek help. I found a support group. Some women sat in a circle, each with their own story of love disguised, tired eyes, but also filled with hope. And as we shared our experiences, something began to change inside me. One woman, in particular, spoke about how freedom isn't just a physical state, but an active choice. She mentioned the need to identify the patterns that bind us. My eyes filled with tears. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone. Others were struggling against invisible chains. I understood that we were all weavers of our own stories, capable of changing the narrative. And then, at that moment, her words entered me like a balm. It was when the truth started to be revealed. The pain wasn't just about him. It was about me, about how I allowed this dynamic to establish itself. I returned home, not with the certainty that everything would be resolved, but with the determination to gather the fragments of my self-confidence. The following week, we sat down to talk. He was so used to seeing me wavering that he didn't expect to hear firmness in my voice. "I need space," I said, almost peremptorily. The silence grew between us like a cloud heavy with electricity. He looked at me with a mix of confusion and anger, but there was also something else. Fear. The fear of losing control. And then, that reaction was a clear signal. What once seemed like adoration was now just possessiveness, a dark shadow, where genuine love had no place. His words began to flow like a turbulent river. "You know this isn't fair," he said, trying to shift the blame. "I care about you." But they were no longer the same words as before. Now, they sounded like a distorted echo. I didn't need this disguised concern. And in that moment, I saw for the first time the true nature of the relationship I was in. I understood that I was no longer fragile. I looked at him and said, "I can't be the person you want me to be anymore." Those words caused a twist, a breakup. It was then that I saw the confusion in his eyes turn into hostility. He didn't know how to handle rejection. In that instant, I realized I needed to distance myself, but not just physically. I had to cut the ties that could no longer be undone. I climbed the stairs to my room, hearing him shout behind me. Each step felt like a different weight, but every weight I left behind was also a relief. My nights became silent, but not like before. Now there was a subtle peace, a new way to connect with my thoughts. I started writing again, free from the fear of being judged. My journal became a sacred space where I could spill everything that was inside me. And each filled page felt like a small victory. But at the same time, there were days when the weight of loss settled in. The shadow of what could have been haunted me. The feeling of loneliness came like a wave, flooding my being. And then, one day, I found an old letter he had written me at the beginning of our relationship. The words were sweet, but upon rereading I could only see the manipulation hidden within the compliments. It made me reflect on how often what seems sweet can hide poison. Love at first sight is sometimes just a game of illusions, and I no longer wanted to live in that illusion. I wanted authenticity, a real connection. And I remembered something I heard in the support group. Vulnerability is the bridge to true intimacy. So, after much reflection and internal confrontations, I began to open myself up to new possibilities, friendships that grew stronger, new encounters. But as I tried to reconnect with others, I noticed another pattern. Insecurity still followed me like a shadow. Even in the simplest interactions, I felt an urge to protect myself, an echo of my previous relationship. That's when a friend approached me and said, "You deserve a love that is light, one that doesn't come with rules." Those words resonated within me. It was as if a flashlight had illuminated the dark corners of my mind. The truth had become clear, and I needed to remind myself of this every day. Over time, I learned to differentiate sincere affection from disguised control. It was a difficult journey, but each step brought me closer to the woman I wanted to be. This journey doesn't end here. There will always be cycles to break. There will always be challenges. And that's when I realized that the phrase I wanted to say from the very beginning wasn't about love or control. It was about freedom. And at the end of my story, I want you to always remember this. I am my own priority. And then, in the midst of this new phase, a memory would occasionally surface. The image of him, not as the man I had loved, but as a reflection of my fears and insecurities. And I found myself thinking, how could a love that was meant to uplift me end up undermining my strength? That's when I met Lucas, a longtime friend. He had always been there in the shadows of my life, but I had never realized the depth of his essence. In our meetings, there was a lightness in the air, casual conversations, laughter that seemed to dance around us. But behind that ease, there was also a disguised fear of repeating the same mistakes. It was strange. My involvement with Lucas was different. We were at the park on a sunny afternoon, surrounded by the sounds of children playing and dogs running. He mentioned something about poetry, and suddenly, everything became clearer. When he read a poem about freedom and authenticity, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, as if an invisible chain had broken. But then, fear began to creep in, whispering that I didn't deserve this, an internal voice that insisted that feeling light was just an illusion. The echo of possessiveness still resonated, and I hesitated to open up completely. That's when I realized that each of Lucas's smiles was an invitation to look within myself. One night we sat on his porch, under a sky full of stars. The conversation flowed naturally, but my chest felt tight. There was something I needed to say. I looked into his eyes, and forcing my voice to emerge, I managed to confess, I'm scared of getting hurt again. He looked at me for a moment, and then, with a gentle tone, replied, That's understandable, but you deserve a love that doesn't trap you. Those words sounded like a hymn. I knew they were true, but the path to that realization had been fraught with thorns. I recalled the unspoken rules of the past, the suffocating expectations, and then I felt the urgency to confront my vulnerability. That night, I wrote in my journal. The words flowed like a river emptying into a deep ocean. Every sentence was a release, a cry for change. I reflected on how it felt to open up. It was as if I was shedding armor that no longer fit me. Weeks went by, and Lucas continued to be a constant support. But there were days when insecurity returned, like a persistent shadow. In one of those moments, while we were walking along the beach, I saw a young woman, smiling, interacting with strangers. She exuded confidence, freedom, and I wanted to be like her. Lucas, do you believe we are free to love without fear? I asked, breaking the silence that surrounded us. He smiled and replied, Free yourself from what doesn't serve you. Love should flow, not be a negotiation. Those words echoed in my mind, and I realized I needed to make peace with my past in order to truly move forward. It was at that point that I decided to confront the truth of my story. I found the courage to communicate to Lucas about the emotional scars that still lingered. I told him that sometimes I hesitated to give myself fully, that I waited for warning signs that never came. You see, it wasn't his fault, but the pain of past experiences still whispered. He listened carefully, his eyes reflecting understanding, and then he said, We can only free ourselves from the past by naming it, and I'm here to support you. The feeling of relief overwhelmed me. The weight I carried lifted a little, as if the light was finally starting to seep into the dark crevices of my soul. Through these conversations, I realized that vulnerability was not synonymous with weakness, but rather an act of courage. I built a new relationship with Lucas based on trust, transparency, and giving each other the space to grow. It was a love without ties, where affection manifested in small things, in simple gestures, in words of encouragement. I allowed myself to feel joy again, to feel the sun on my skin during our walks on the beach, to smile genuinely, without masks. And with that, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been dormant, dreams that had been left behind. Yet, even so, echoes of the past still surfaced at unexpected moments. One night, while we were watching a movie, a scene of control and jealousy triggered a wave of anxiety within me. I felt my heart race, and my breathing become heavy. My old fears began to resurface, but Lucas, attentive, noticed. He held my hand and said, "Remember, you are free. Here, you can be who you truly are." That was like a balm. Instead of stepping back, I took a deep breath and shared my feelings. I talked about what that scene evoked in me, and Lucas not only listened, but embraced me. In that moment, I understood that being open didn't mean losing my power. On the contrary, it meant reclaiming it. So as the months passed, the wounds began to heal. Amid laughter, new dreams were forged. And with each tear that fell, there was a silent promise to never again let someone define my worth. And then, looking back, I realized that true love isn't the kind that traps you, but the kind that helps you soar. The love that brings no rules, but freedom. And the phrase I wanted to say from the start was this: I am enough, just as I am.